So welcome back, everyone. I'm Lenny Wild. I'm head of the Politics and Governance program at ODI, and delighted to have you at this session that calls on us to take a reality check on the implementation of development effectiveness. So sorry to pull you back from your coffee breaks, but we have an excellent panel and I think a chance to pick up on a lot of themes that have come up today. So please do take your seats. I mean, we've been hearing already this morning that evidence in terms of the implementation of development effectiveness is mixed. And mixed in the English language is really a polite word that can mask a lot of different views, right? For some, it's a code word for failure. For others, it's genuinely about a sort of representing a mixed bag. But I think those are the sorts of things for us to delve into now. And to me, there's at least three areas that I think it would be great for us to touch upon. The first is I think we've had a long debate and I think growing evidence base that aid effectiveness in particular has struggled to accommodate the political realities, the incentives within both aid giving and aid receiving countries. And so there's a question about where these principles go now. There's been a broadening of them to encompass development effectiveness, but whether they can actually genuinely shape or constrain behavior of different actors seems to me a key question. The second is that I think this transition from aid to development effectiveness is an interesting one, but one that perhaps at the moment seems to have an unfulfilled potential. You know, this agenda has got more fragmented, more diffuse. There's a question about whether one set of principles can be fit for purpose in this kind of growing and more diverse landscape. But I also think there's a question about how we make better use of the non-aid instruments, tools, and approaches that are available. And it feels like even this morning, as we saw, we keep falling back into our aid comfort zones. So how do we genuinely break out of those? And the third point, I think, that shapes our discussion is that there are now sustained and growing calls for more radical change to aid and development assistance. Now, those calls are coming from different quarters, some of which are more or less sympathetic to the sorts of issues that we're talking about here today. One of those calls has been a push for support to be to move much further away from coming in with a set of externally imposed solutions and to be much more genuinely about how you strengthen systems, institutions, facilitate people to solve problems for themselves, whether they sit within government or outside of government. And I've been part of a network called Doing Development Differently that has tried to better document experience of support that tries to do just that, but also push for change in big development agencies. You know, that network was, I guess, born out of a frustration that these principles have been around for a long time, but they're not translating into reality. So I guess final question for us is how do we stop having the same conversations and what will it take to really move this on? So I think we have an excellent panel to reflect on some of those themes. We have Brenda Killen, who's Deputy Director at OECD's Development Cooperation Directorate. I think known to many of you, has a long history, I think almost a decade, of following these processes as an insider, as well as past experience at WHO, DFID, and more. We have Neil Cole, who's Executive Secretary for CABRI, the Collaborative Africa Budget Reform Initiative, that I think will be known to many of you as a platform that really brings together African ministries of finance and planning. And he's both been an integral part of the development of that initiative, but also previously was in the Treasury in South Africa, and so I think can give us a real reality check on how this looks and feels from within ministries of finance. We have Tony Tujan, who I think again will be known to many of you, Director of eBon International. He's a social activist who's worked in the Philippines and internationally and has been a part of a number of the CSO platforms that have fed into this agenda in different ways over the years. And then finally, we have apologies from Anna Hentinen at DFID, who unfortunately is not very well and so can't join us today. But I'm pleased to say that Paddy Carter has stepped into the breach and joins us. He's a research fellow at ODI and author of a briefing paper that's in your pack, which sort of set the scene for the discussion that we'll be having in this session, which I would urge you all to have a look at if you haven't already. So time is short, and I don't want to keep you all from your lunch for too much longer. But I think what we're going to do is we're going to hand over to each of our panelists to give us an opening 5 minutes, and then we'll come to all of you for thoughts and reflections. And Brenda, I think we'll turn to you first. As an insider on this process, can you give us some of your top lines in terms of what's worked and what hasn't? And maybe particularly with this transition towards development effectiveness, are we seeing signs that that's genuinely leading to some changes in some of the power dynamics, the inclusion of different voices in this agenda?
Thank you. And I think both you, Lenny, have encouraged me to be a bit more provocative here, and also a colleague in the audience was saying that the presentation on the early monitoring results yesterday was maybe a bit more negative than it should be. So, I mean, with that in view, I'm probably going to be a bit incoherent because I've thrown my speaking points away, and I'm just going to say some views from looking at this from the inside. And I think actually Helder put it very well in the last session, just saying we still talk about these principles, they still matter deeply for the fragile states. And that really is a frontier in terms of leave no one behind. It's certainly where aid will be focused over the next few years and decades. So I think it's easy for us to forget how much has changed because of the focus on aid effectiveness and because of now, since Busan, the focus on development effectiveness. So a conversation that reflects that a broad range of partners have a role in this. It's not just about aid, though aid is an important part of that. The aid effectiveness principles were grounded in very important evidence, and in fact we looked at some of that evidence this morning when we were looking at challenges with the multilateral system and where the funding of the multilateral system is working well and where we're not getting the most from what we're putting in. So these principles still matter. I think one thing that we risk doing is forgetting that this is actually a highly political agenda. It has been translated into technical principles, technical ways of working, but it's really about how we come together and look at whose development is this, what's needed, where the resources go, who's accountable, what do we say we're doing, and then how we hold each other to account for doing that. I think the fact that this process has really debated what ownership is, and I'm pleased that Amy mentioned in the last session that when we talk about ownership, it's not just ownership by the government, it's democratic ownership, it's ownership in the country, and that is a debate which will go on, but this work has brought that into the discussion on development cooperation. One of the greatest successes in this process, I think, is the fact that civil society organisations were recognised as development actors in their own right and sit at the table in the discussions in the global partnership and in discussions around development effectiveness and the monitoring in countries and at regional level. So the fact that a platform has been created which is informal but it's inclusive and there's an equal voice, and these technical issues, but political issues come out in those discussions. So it's changed the concept of how we can have a legitimate conversation about development cooperation. And in that sense, the aid effectiveness and development effectiveness work preceded and anticipated the call in Agenda 2030 for a global partnership for development. The platform has supported other efforts, whether it's the New Deal, whether it's the International Health Partnership, whether it's the Effective Institutions Platform, it's seeded other work on how we can make sure that everyone's cooperation comes together well to deliver for development results. And we've seen from the Paris Declaration evaluation and from other evaluations that countries that have really grasped this agenda have progressed. So countries that have taken on board the concept of ownership and be more directive about where they want development cooperation and how that should be delivered. I think the fact that we have 81 countries taking part in the monitoring survey is a huge success. It's not easy for the countries to do this, and yet countries are voting with their feet. And I know everyone took the stagnation word away from the presentation yesterday, but what we will do in the global partnership is we'll look at what does this mean, what's happening behind this trend, but in parallel with this trend, there's a real focus on building institutions in development programs and a real call for whether systems are used or not to deliver aid. There's been real progress on building institutions, and I think Neil can speak to that. Another success that the development effectiveness work has spurred, the Global Partnership in its monitoring survey will report to the High-Level Political Forum in the review of Goal 17. I think the fact that we have co-chairs with a donor, a middle-income country, and a least developed country leading this work, it's breaking boundaries. And I was very pleased to see that Malawi was one of the people reporting on the US peer review in OECD last week. So a major change there in terms of voice and where we get evidence from. So I probably have to bring this to a close now. Just a message to everyone that we shouldn't be complacent. We shouldn't be complacent about this agenda. It is political. We need to keep going to those difficult areas and looking at how we can be effective. I think the discussion so far in this group has been a bit too focused on aid. It's been different from the discussion we had in the Busan Global Partnership Forum in Seoul the other week. We need to reflect the other players around the table and start looking at how we bring them in, how we set standards that are recognised by everyone and monitor behaviour with philanthropics, with the private sector, with emerging donors, with local governments, with the whole group of partners who will deliver Agenda 2030. And also, yes, we can comment on what's happening, but let's actually look at what we need to do. I think, Simon, you were right to say we're fighting for the relevance of aid. We're fighting for aid to continue to be supported. So we need to think about this in a very different space. It has to be political. Let's look at how we make the case for a resource that's, I'm sorry, I'm going back to aid again here, but we have 140 billion a year being collected through taxation. How do we use that to deliver Agenda 2030? It requires us to think very differently, and the development effectiveness debate and the global partnership is a space to do that. So I think the discussion we just had on leave no one behind, we need to unpack that. I think that the principles, the Busan principles, already speak to how we leave no one behind. But it's exactly the kind of challenging political issue that we need this space, this development effectiveness space, to unpack and look at what we do so that we can make Agenda 2030 a reality. And we can certainly have a story that we can tell to taxpayers as to why it makes sense for them to still support international collective action. So thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Sort of quite an upbeat and forward-looking perspective. Neil, given your work on country systems, can you give us your assessment about how well this agenda, or whether it has made a genuine difference to the use of those systems, and whether that can be sustained, particularly when we're seeing rollback in areas like budget support from some funders?
Thank you. What the agenda did do, starting with Paris and in particular Busan, was to raise this expectation that as a system was going to improve, whether that was the budgeting system or the procurement system, that would lead to an increase in the use of country systems by development partners for the delivery of aid. I think what we have seen in the Global Monitoring Report, and particularly for Africa, and I think Fanuel and Brenda confirmed this point yesterday, that there is a weak, if any, kind of correlation between the strength of a system and the extent to which those systems are being used. And what we're also seeing in a study that was undertaken by CABRI in Tanzania and Burundi, and also our work that we're doing now in Senegal, is that there appears to be a threshold effect. So where development partners get to a point of use of country systems, and they don't move from that point whether a system improves or the system deteriorates. And I think I think there are three problems that I can relate this to. The first is that I think there's a problem with the text in all the declarations, Paris, Busan, and Accra, and that is that it creates this all or nothing approach, where we think that a system is something that exists in its entirety, and if any one of the components are weaker than others, we, as well as development partners, don't use the system. And in the work that we are doing as CABRI, we'd like to think of a use of country systems, not necessarily as budget support, because I think that confusion is often created. And that confusion is often created when ministers of finance in partner countries have the negotiations with development partners, that the question that is asked is, so are you going to move to greater budget support? And in many cases, the answer is no. And how that is interpreted is as if you're saying that you're reneging on use of country systems, or you're reneging on the commitment that is contained in the various declarations. So how we'd like to think of use of countries is not as a single system, but more as a system that comprises of different components, where the fiduciary risk is quite different across those components, and where with less fiduciary risk you can start to take a almost blanket approach to calling that for those systems to be used, and maybe delaying the use of other systems. So I'm trying to get the slide up, and it's the only slide that I'm going to be...
On the right-hand one, is that working?
That's the right-hand one, yeah. Okay, maybe if you can move it on. Thanks. Okay. So, we did a study in 2010 that started to change our thinking about use of country systems, and some of this was taken to Accra and also to Busan, where you think of a country system in terms of the PFM cycle as the plan, the budget, the treasury function, the accounting function, reporting, auditing, procurement, and parliament. And we think that there's a different fiduciary risk in each of these components. So what we're encouraging countries that we work with to do is, in the negotiation with their development partners, to see how all aid can be on plan. So by the time countries are formulating their plans, that they have a strong sense of the development assistance that they're going to receive. And on budget, we don't mean budget support, we mean that all aid is on and included and integrated into the budget process. So where countries are putting their budgets together, that they have a good sense of what aid is going to be available for allocation. And by implication, this would mean that all aid would then flow via a Ministry of Finance for allocation. The next one that we think where there's hardly any, if any, fiduciary risk, and that is to put aid on Parliament. So make aid part of the appropriation that Parliament does. And that, I think, if you get those three right, you help with governance, you help with ownership, and you certainly improve accountability, because it is about the plan that's been approved by the government, the budget allocation that has been through a iterative, comprehensive process, and where Parliament has an engagement, you bring in the accountability because you then have parliamentary oversight. In our work with countries, many of them admit that they're not ready to include aid on procurement, and they point to capacity mainly, and they also point to the timeliness and effectiveness of their own system as opposed to the procurement system of a donor. So what we want to do, and we're going to speak a bit more about this in the speed geeking session, is to propose text for Nairobi that calls for all aid to be on plan, to be on budget, and to be on Parliament, and to have a further text that speaks about at what stage you'd be ready to move towards aid being on procurement and some of the other components. I think there's another factor, and that is the risk and the type of risk that I spoke of. So what we often find is that the reason that development partners are not using country systems is because they are thinking about the short-term risk. the fear that money will be stolen or the fear that funds will not be used for their intended purpose. And we want to propose that the view that you take on risk should be one that is more about the long-term risk of not using systems which could have a more detrimental effect on development. And then quickly, and finally, the third, which I think is a blame that I place on partner countries, and that is that partner countries are not using the space to engage with their development partners in the country on just having open discussions on what the state of their systems are and admitting to where systems are weak and what those weaknesses are, so that you can move together in strengthening those systems and start to use those systems. And where systems are strong, to have confident discussions about when systems can be used. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think a very sort of constructive proposition, as well as plug for this afternoon's session. Tony, turning to you, I mean, tell us what you think. And I think, we want to spur a bit of debate and discussion here. So are we getting more effective? And are you seeing any more genuine inclusion of civil society and citizens' perspectives or not?
Let me start with a reminder to us that development cooperation is really about risk. You either walk away and just stay, exit into your island, or you cooperate with the world. And in that way, you also contribute to the development of the world, to your neighbors, as well as yourself. And therefore, development cooperation is about embracing risk. We have always said in the Working Party several years ago that it's not simply about managing risk. We cannot be risk averse. We should embrace that, because that is development cooperation is about. The problem is that we might have leadership fatigue. Development effectiveness, aid effectiveness, are strategic agendas, and you cannot take it with a quick fix attitude. It's not a quick fix. It's something that you have to continue building it. And we've had this problem in the Working Party and after Accra, that there are weak incentives for reforming donor behavior. So the main issue really to make effectiveness work is that there should be clear incentives, not only in the whole relationship of donorship, the fact that development cooperation is voluntary, and therefore, how can you ensure that the work at the ground by the staff doing the actual work benefits with the same assurance of incentives? And that's all that we have for the partner countries or CSOs. Why? Because it's all voluntary. So if the donors walk away, then that's going to be the end of the conversation, and probably in the world. Now, the problem, of course, is that we should have civil society that can work also to ensure that that assurance. For example, big donors like Japan or US or like Korea, they don't believe in country systems. And that becomes a blot on effectiveness. And so it becomes the work of the parliament and civil society to convince donor policy to ensure that they should work with systems, but then no way. And therefore, in Busan, we had to accept words that were not good enough, really, if you ask me, on the question of country systems. Then it becomes a responsibility of parliaments and citizens to improve donor behavior. On the other hand, we need to have what I would call accountable ownership. We talk about democratic ownership, but democratic ownership really means accountability for our governments. And in the end, it's about how do you ensure that HRBA, human rights-based approaches, are operationalized. So overall, if you look at the situation, I think that things are generally moving in relation to donor-country relations, if you will. But the situation is horrible for civil society. You need civil society to ensure accountability, but the enabling environment for civil society is growing worse and worse by the day or by the month. And you'll find situations all over Africa, Asia, and so on. And then if I look at the situation from the lens of civil society, then I will say, what effectiveness are you talking about? Thank you.
Okay, so Paddy, tell us, can these principles, can the development effectiveness agenda really be reconciled with calls to do development differently, especially given some of the scale of the challenge that we've just heard?
Thank you, Lenny. Well, I'm going to start in the place where I think the movement you mentioned, doing development differently, starts, and that is to kind of approach this question by looking directly at the effectiveness of development cooperation in its own right. And I'm not going to attempt to summarize the effectiveness of all development cooperation in the world in one sentence. And I recognize this is backwards looking and things might be changing for the better. But if you look at the track record of more ambitious, maybe more important development interventions, such as attempts to reform governance, build local capacity, strengthen health systems, there are some pretty damning assessments out there. I'm thinking of books like Matt Andrews' The Limits to Institutional Reform in Development, and a report by Lenny and colleagues called Adapting Development, which starts at a look at the performance trends in the social sectors in Africa. And whilst the picture is mixed in the sense of mixed, not mixed in the sense of a failure, the overall conclusion that could do better, that's hard to escape. So if one accepts that the track record of development cooperation is disappointing, then that tells us that either these development effectiveness principles are not being followed, or if they are being followed, then they do not make development truly effective. So the global partnership process, it is bottom-up in the sense that it reflects the views of governments and civil society in the places that matter. It's not an imposition by donors. But in another sense, the process can still be quite top-down. It asks questions like, does a national development cooperation policy exist, and have donors and governments agreed at a high level to align their activities? So this other movement that Lenny mentioned, doing development differently, if you're not familiar with it, the conference note that Lenny mentioned in your packs does summarize the Doing Development Differently manifesto. There's also an ODI Doing Development Differently website, which collects all our work on this theme. And I must blow my own trumpet and say that I also have a paper over there which looks at adaptive development from a contracting perspective. Now, this movement has emerged from development practitioners, NGOs, aid agency staff, who are all frustrated by the ineffectiveness of traditional development interventions, and they want to see a revolution in how development is done. Doing development differently has a lot in common with the Busan principles, particularly its emphasis on local ownership and results. Its centerpiece, which I don't think is part of the Busan principles, is about the need to experiment and to learn and to adapt. And this is a reaction against traditional development projects which have set out to implement a pre-designed plan. Now, doing development differently is bottom-up in a different sense. It's all about what happens at the project level, not about whether donors and governments have agreed things at a high level. In fact, some of the background motivation for doing development differently might offer us some insights into why the official process has disappointed, if you think that it has disappointed. First, doing development differently emphasizes the importance of politics and the need to find ways of working with, or maybe around, the politics and incentives of the local stakeholders in context. Secondly, proponents of doing development differently often observe that traditional development often results in the form, but not the substance. Academics love fancy words, and they like to use a phrase from biology, isomorphic mimicry here. And this is a frog that looks like a leaf, but it's really still a frog. Their point is that development interventions often see things like governments and donors agree on reforms, new legislation is written, training programs are attended, but nothing really changes. So perhaps donors could have what they might look like they've aligned behind country priorities, get a tick in the Busan box, but maybe they're still doing what they want to do. In yesterday's Q&A session, the question was asked, and I don't think it was answered, isn't it time we talked about the power and the politics behind all this? And the Doing Development Differently crowd would definitely say yes. It's not hard to see some of the power and politics that might undermine the Busan process. To caricature, if donors want to get money out the door and recipients want to get money in the door, then nobody really has an incentive to invest in results measurement and confront the reality of whether their efforts are effective or not. Another plug for an ODI paper, look up one called Accountability Dilemmas in Foreign Aid by Paolo D'Orenzio, and this traces many of the problems in development to the fact that the priority of the people with the money is to be accountable to the politicians and the taxpayers that provide that money, and they want to be able to demonstrate short-run results. And that often means that they don't want to put developing countries in the driving seat, trust their systems and their results frameworks. And for an example of this, we don't have to look any further than the decision of the UK to withdraw from general budget support. So doing development differently offers a way around some of these problems. DDD proponents often speak of having teams of development entrepreneurs on the ground trying to identify and tackle locally defined problems and waiting until they have that ownership, until they have built inclusive partnerships around the project before they scale up. So you could see that maybe this is a way of recognizing the reality that the donor will always retain ownership of how their money is spent in a sense, but if things are done right, the two will come together and donors will only start spending money when they have achieved that local ownership at the micro level. Now, I'll be quick, I've got to finish. I'm not sure where to go with this. Part of doing development differently is skeptical about the value of indicators and ticking boxes, so maybe it doesn't want to be part of the Busan process. And I'm not an expert in how to make change happen via the medium of intergovernmental agreements, but and it's probably too late to change anything in Nairobi now, but maybe a start could be made by talking a bit more openly about some of the politics and the power in these relationships that maybe work against the Busan principles, and perhaps bringing doing development differently into the fold to some extent, because as far as I'm aware, these two movements have evolved completely independently.
Great, thank you. So lots of food for thought. We have about 30 minutes now before lunch. I'd like to take a round of questions to kick us off, and it'd be great if you could say who you are and try to keep those interventions fairly short so we can bring in as many people as possible. So who would like to kick us off? Please put your hands up.